that. So
yes.
Stay tuned for that. But right now, I want you to join me in welcoming a very special guest with a very special story. She's an editor for Sonoma Christian Home. She's an author of an amazing book, Finding True Freedom. And as I said before, as we were talking about before, freedom is kind of our theme tonight. Please help me welcome Ginny Brant. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
It's great to be here. Thank you, girls.
Well, it's great to have you here, and you have a fascinating story, but we don't have hours and hours that we could go on about your entire story. You've got so much to share. So start us kind of at the beginning about how you grew up in a political world in Washington, D.C.
I grew up, yes, I did grow up in Washington, D.C. because my father served as senator and 3 presidents. And we were just this family that everyone looked to and said, they have it all together. You know, wouldn't I want to be in that family? And it was a wonderful family. My parents taught us character. They taught us good works. And we were busily paving our way to heaven with our good works. We were members of a church. And we still didn't understand what Christianity was all about. And at age 16, through a ministry called Young Life, I learned that Jesus had a plan for my life, and it wasn't about me telling God to bless my plans. It was about seeking His will for my life, and that's when I began that journey of saying, Lord, take my life, let it be consecrated to you. What is it you would have me do in this world? And it's still a gradual process of doing that. But the interesting thing is, I was 16, and I had no idea what was ahead of me. God intervened in my life before my mother was hospitalized with severe depression and before Watergate came into our lives, because my father was an aide in the Nixon administration. And so God was preparing me, teaching me His word and building me up so that I would be able to stand in the fire when it came.
So your dad he assisted 3 presidents, is that right?
The main one that
Nixon.
he worked for full-time was Richard Nixon.
Okay.
But he also advised Bush, Gerald Ford, and he was a kitchen cabinet member like for Ronald Reagan.
Oh, wonderful. So you have wonderful memories of going to the White House as a child. Tell us about that.
Well, my husband's with me here tonight, and we can both say that we had some wonderful memories. He was my boyfriend back then. We've both been in the White House in blue jeans by accident. I came in on the train to see my dad before we had moved to Washington, and I hadn't brushed my hair, nothing. And he goes, we've had an emergency meeting at the White House. He picked me up at the train station, took me right in, hid me in his office in the East Wing, and I had to go to the bathroom and ran into Pat Nixon. So, yes, we had some wonderful memories, but my mother didn't find out about that until much later in life. She probably would have killed both of us for the way I looked and the way I was dressed in the White House.
You were just being casual.
That's exactly right.
A little too casual.
Well, it's a fascinating story, Ginny, because your story goes back. Your father was very busy, obviously serving under Richard Nixon, and how was that for you as a child growing up, longing for that relationship with your father, and yet he's caught up in politics? I mean, we so often don't really understand the sacrifice that many of our politicians make.
Politics is a tough life. I mean, I look at the candidates who've been running for, let's just say, president lately. They've all been on the road, either party, whatever, just run, 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 run. The ones that have young children, they're hardly ever home. I mean, it's a very difficult thing. And when you are one of the president's men, the phone rings nonstop, 24 hours a day. Sometimes I would answer the White House line because I could get the line before my father got up. But it is that type of life. My dad was always on a plane with the president. And you have to figure out if you're going to be in that type of life, and if God's led you in that type of life, and He does lead people to do that, and we need God to lead people to do that, how you're going to put your family so that you don't desert your family and your children. And my dad was so wrapped up in it, he didn't know how to do that. He grew up in a dysfunctional home with an alcoholic father, so he didn't know how to do that, and he finally came back to us after his spiritual transformation and said, I am so sorry. Please forgive me. And I promised to be a better husband and father, and he was.
You know, I heard some of your interviews that you've done many through the years, such a wonderful testimony, and you said you would go to him. You would, wherever he was, you would try to, in order just to have time with your father, and it was your prayers that eventually brought him to the Lord. Tell us about that journey and him coming to know Christ.
Well, when I became a Christian at age 16, I just assumed my parents were Christians too because they brought me up in the church, you know. And then I began to realize when Watergate hit, and my dad takes me out to eat at our favorite Waffle House restaurant, and he explains to me that the president and his men are going down, and that he didn't know anything about Watergate, which turned out to be true, but when the ship goes down, the president and his men all go down, and that he might be going to prison. Now, I just turned 17. I am already taking care of my 10-year-old brother, and my mother's hospitalized for severe depression, and he's breaking this news to me, I may go to prison too. And that's when I said, Dad, you need to trust God. If you're innocent, God will prove you to be right if you're innocent. And I realized in the way that my dad, he said, no, you don't understand. God can't help me here. And I kept saying, oh, yes, he can. So I realized at that point that maybe my dad didn't understand what Christianity was all about. And I began to pray for him and pray for him, I mean, every day, summoning God, beckoning God to help my father understand, to help him through the Watergate trials. And I wanted him to understand the Jesus that I knew. And I wanted to say, Dad, don't you know it's more important to serve the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords than the president? You've got your order out of life. But I was cautioned by wise counsel not to beat my father over the head with the gospel. I had to pray, live my life as a witness, and let God take care of business.
Yeah, Ginny, that's important. And I think that's something that our audience, and it's something I had to learn. We're not somebody else's Holy Spirit.
That's
so
right.
Stop for just a moment, because I think that's such a powerful statement, and speak to that point on how you were wisely counseled to witness through your acts and your behavior rather than beating somebody over the head with the gospel.
It never works to beat them over the head, but when it's your family or your spouse or your parent or your child, your actions must speak louder than your words. They must see Jesus more in your walk than in your talk.
Well,
so I had to be careful about what I said. And it is true that I put a plaque under my dad's pillow. I was really frustrated. I put a plaque under his pillow that said, "The purpose of life is to serve God." I never knew what happened to it until years later that becomes the logo for his ministry. So what people don't realize, when you're praying and that person's watching you, I mean, I went through poverty and didn't get the college education all paid for in a fancy way that my siblings got, because I went to a place my dad didn't want me to go to, a Bible college that was going to teach, was going to integrate the Christian life for me with all the subject areas. And that was very, very important to me. So when I went there against his wishes, I got kind of cut off. Okay? But as I kept on going and kept on going, him watching me do that, God was speaking to him the whole time. And God was using so many other things as well. It wasn't just me. He was using the testimony of Chuck Colson, who was, you know, in the White House with him. He saw him turn around before his eyes.
Awesome.
So when you're praying for that loved one, don't stop praying.
Now, actually, he came to know Christ after taking a trip, is that right?
To the Holy Land.
Okay, tell us about that.
My mother, for her anniversary gift, wanted to go to the Holy Land. She always had, you know, spiritual desires. And she thought, well, if I can just get him away from politics and get him to the Holy Land, you know, everything will be okay. Well, he almost couldn't go. The last minute he went, and he went with Dr. Ed Young, who's now pastor of Second Baptist, Dallas.
Right.
And he's calling my husband and I long distance and saying, oh, it's all true. Jesus is alive. I walked where Jesus walked. It was, and my husband and I were going, of course it's true, you know, but it was so funny to see, and that's all he would talk about. So that made it, that was just one of the things God used to make it real in his heart for him to realize that, you know, Jesus really did live, and what he said really is true, and he really is the Son of God. And Harry did. You're walking by God's definition of success.
Awesome.
When you need to be, I mean, by your own, you need to be walking by God's definition of success.
Yeah, right.
So when he realized that, it was a powerful change, just a powerful change.
Now, you make the statement that finding true freedom is discovering what you were really intended to do, what God intended for you to do. Speak to that for just a moment to our audience, because we've all experienced not knowing, you know, where would God have us, and we're trying to go down life and in our careers and in our paths, but what is true freedom in that respect?
Well, my dad and I did not know for quite some time, because we were the Freedom family. My dad went into politics, and in the military service for the sake of freedoms of this country. And that's high and noble service for the people who do that. But it took us a while to realize that God didn't give us our freedoms so that we can just bask in the American dream and have all these materialistic things and have the best of everything. He gave this country our freedoms so that we can follow the will of God in our lives, and that is unique to His unique plan for each person. And my dad and I were just so good at, okay, God, this is my 5-year plan, my 10-year plan, and then put Him on the shelf, okay? And then we're in trouble, beg for Him to come out. That's not the way the Christian life works. It's all about Him and what He wants to do through you, and His plans are greater. His plans, I mean, I look at His plans for my dad. He took my dad and I into all the places in the world that we went. People had no freedom. From Romania and the underground church in China, and I've been in the Middle East where there is no freedom. And yet I met believers. There are people there who have freedom. And God ended up using my dad in a way He never anticipated. He helped the underground church come to freedom after communism and helped their political leaders to come to freedom, because Romania, the infrastructure was totally destroyed by communism. So you never know what God has in store until you check in with Him.
So good. And God's used you through the years as an educator and a counselor.
32 years in education.
Yes.
You just retired.
I just retired last June.
Awesome.
That's awesome.
And you've helped kids find freedom through Christ. I'm sure you're limited in what you're able to share, but, you know, share your heart on that and you know, your ministry as an educator.
I did approach my 32 years in education when I taught at a secular university or in the public school system. I approached it as a ministry, and I think everyone needs to look at that. Where I had opportunities to share Christ, I did it. Sometimes I had to get parental permission, okay? I did Christian parenting after school and before school. That is legal. You can quote the Bible. You can use truths from the Bible.
You taught parents how to be better. Oh, I love that.
That was part of it. I brought a Christian approach to that. When I taught at a university, I just told them up front, this is where I come from, this is what the psychologists say, this is what I say, this is what the Bible says, you decide. You decide. So I tried to use it whenever I could. And there are many people doing that in the public schools today. And if I had a child who was heartbroken, you know, honestly, I'd call up a pastor, live down the street, and say, you know what, you might want to check with this child and see if they want to come to your church program. And I used pastors a lot. I used every tool God gave me to try to, not to push the gospel on people, that's not my job, but to be a living presence of Christ wherever I went.
That's beautiful.
And to introduce the gospel. And your book, Finding True Freedom, talk just a little bit about what was it like to write this story and what is in this story, because I've read most of this. It is absolutely fascinating. You talk about your father's time in the White House. You talk about you growing up in that era, and then the second half of the book you go into finding that true freedom and the transformation that was made. So some of the things we talked about tonight, but talk a little bit more about your book.
The book starts in the middle of the Watergate Trials, and it was Chuck Colson, my cover endorser, that told me to do that. He said, you've got to start in the middle of a crisis. And I said, my mom doesn't want me to talk about Watergate. She wants to put it in the past. But it starts there because it shows a father-daughter journey of faith and freedom as he's forbidding me to do all these things, and I'm trying to pray him through Watergate, and God's working in his heart. And then when he grabs a hold of his heart, how father and daughter, who were not dancing to the same tune. We were always dancing the same tune, then we weren't. And the book shows how we came back together and we're dancing to the same tune because God has gotten a hold of our hearts.
Praise God. And he's in heaven now.
Yes.
Watching you carry out the legacy of your family and your faith.
And I run the ministry that he started, Laity Alive and Serving.
Okay, and that's in a ministry still to Romania and
different things. The deaf are included because my husband works with the deaf.
Awesome. That is awesome.
And he was actually an honorary citizen of Romania.
For all he did for the country, they gave him honorary citizenship. And I didn't I didn't get to go for that trip to Romania. My sister went when he received that award. That was his last trip to Romania. He got honorary citizenship.
What a great man.
What a beautiful story, and what an encouraging story. And I really think that I have been inspired by this.
Yes.
And I really pray that those who read it will also be inspired to take that journey. You know, all of our stories are different, but we all have a story.
We all have a loved one we want to see in heaven.
Yes, we do.
That's right.
And they can be encouraged here to find that. So Finding True Freedom, tell our audience a little bit more about how they can find out more about you, how they can follow you, and find out more about you. You write for Sonoma Christian Home. We hadn't been able to talk about that. And
So
I'm also a
much.
speaker.
and yes.
I would say the best way is just to go to my website, Ginny, G-I-N-N-Y, Brant, B-R-A-N-T.com.
Awesome.
Everything's
Good.
on there.
And she's a mom of 3 boys.
Yes, she is.
Which you and I have boys. We need some time with you. Can you just stick around? And
I've survived so far.
I know, we have to so far. The
So
journey's
far.
not over yet, though, is
That's
it?
right. That's
well,
right.
thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And there's, like I said, there's so many more details. I really pray you're going to want to go out and you're going to want to get this book, because
Yes.
this is an amazing story. So
Yes.
thank you so much for sharing it with us and our
yes,
audience.
thank you.
And thank you for having me.
Wonderful to meet you, and so awesome to hear about how her father found freedom through Jesus Christ, and that's the theme of our night tonight. And